The world trembled as the French Revolution unleashed a chaos that only one artillery genius could master. Born on the rugged island of Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte carried the spirit of rebellion in his blood from the very start. The dusty streets of Ajaccio shaped a boy who would one day command the grandest armies in history. He studied the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar, dreaming of glory while others played childish games. The military academy in Brienne became his forge, tempering his will against the insults of aristocratic classmates. Isolated by his strange accent and fierce pride, he found solace in mathematics and the logic of artillery.
Liberty,
he understood that artillery was the god of war, capable of breaking the strongest lines with mathematical precision. Paris erupted in revolution, tearing down the monarchy and opening a path for talent over birthright. Napoleon watched the chaos with a calculated gaze, knowing his moment to strike was approaching fast. The young lieutenant returned to Corsica, but political strife forced him to flee his homeland forever. He arrived in France as a refugee, possessing nothing but his uniform and a burning ambition. The siege of Toulon became the stage where the obscure officer would first display his tactical brilliance. British ships choked the harbor, threatening to strangle the fragile French Republic in its cradle. Napoleon surveyed the terrain, realizing that capturing the heights of L'Aiguillette would force the British fleet to withdraw. He positioned his cannons with obsessive care, calculating trajectories to rain fire upon the enemy ships. The night of the assault was dark and stormy, the air filled with the scent of rain and gunpowder. He led the charge personally. His horse shot out from under him as he stormed the earthworks. The British defenses crumbled under the relentless bombardment of his carefully placed batteries. Toulon fell, and the name Bonaparte was whispered with respect in the halls of power for the first time. Promoted to brigadier general at 24, he had proven that cannons could dictate the fate of nations. Yet the shifting tides of politics saw him briefly imprisoned, his destiny hanging by a fragile thread. Released but destitute, he wandered the streets of Paris, a general without an army to command. Fate intervened when the royalist uprising threatened the National Convention in the heart of Paris. Barras turned to the young general, knowing only he possessed the ruthlessness to save the government. Napoleon did not hesitate, deploying cannons through the narrow streets of the capital. He unleashed a whiff of grape shot, clearing the mob with a brutal and decisive volley of iron. The streets fell silent, and the Republic was saved by the cold logic of artillery fire. Now a hero of the convention, he was given command of the Army of Italy. Before leaving, he fell under the spell of Rose de Beauharnais, whom he renamed Josephine. Their passion was as volatile as the revolution, a love that would haunt him across every battlefield. He arrived in Italy to find an army in rags, starving and demoralized by neglect. He stood before them, small and pale, yet radiating an energy that electrified the weary soldiers. He promised them honor, glory, and riches if they would follow him into the fertile plains of Lombardy. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of speed, deception, and overwhelming violence. He ignored the established rules of war, moving his troops faster than the enemy thought possible. At Montanate, he struck the Austrian center, splitting their forces and driving them into retreat. The Battle of Lodi became a legend, where he risked his life to cross a bridge under heavy fire. His soldiers began to call him the Little Corporal, seeing him fight alongside them in the mud. He utilized his artillery not just for siege, but as a mobile force to blast holes in infantry lines. The Austrians were baffled by this young general who attacked every day and fought at night. At Arcole, the fighting was desperate, the bridge becoming a slaughterhouse of French and Austrian troops. Napoleon seized a flag and rushed forward, inspiring his men to push through the hail of bullets. He entered Milan as a liberator, establishing new republics and reshaping the map of Italy. The plunder of art and gold flowed back to Paris, cementing his status as the savior of France. He had defeated the mighty Austrian Empire, forcing them to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio. He returned to Paris not just as a general, but as a political force to be reckoned with. The Directory feared his popularity, seeing a potential dictator in the hero of Italy. To keep him occupied, they approved his audacious plan to strike at British interests in Egypt. He dreamed of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, conquering the mysterious East. The expedition was a massive undertaking, carrying soldiers, scientists, and the printing press to Africa. The Mamluks waited in the desert, their cavalry glittering in the sun, unaware of modern French tactics. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon formed his troops into hollow squares to repel the charge. The Mamluk horsemen broke against the walls of French bayonets and the thunder of cannon fire. He famously told his men that 40 centuries of history were looking down upon them. Cairo fell, and the French scholars began to uncover the secrets of the ancient pharaohs. Yet disaster struck at sea when Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Stranded in Egypt, Napoleon continued to govern and reform, displaying his administrative genius. He marched into Syria, facing the plague and the stubborn defenses of Acre. The siege failed, and he was forced to retreat back to Egypt across the scorching desert. Despite the setbacks, he crafted a narrative of victory that reached the newspapers in France. Hearing of political instability back home, he decided to abandon his army and return to Paris. He risked capture by the British Navy, slipping across the Mediterranean like a ghost in the mist. France was in turmoil, the Directory corrupt, and the people crying out for a strong leader. He arrived to a hero's welcome, the failures in Egypt forgotten amidst the cheers of the crowd. The coup of 18 Brumaire was launched, a complex political maneuver to seize absolute power. He entered the legislative chamber, facing shouting deputies who threatened to outlaw him as a tyrant. His brother Lucien saved the day, calling on the soldiers to expel the corrupt politicians. The bayonets cleared the hall, and the consulate was established with Napoleon as first consul. He was now the master of France, 30 years old and holding the reins of a great power. He immediately set to work, reforming the law, the economy, and the education system. The Napoleonic Code was drafted, a legal foundation that would influence Europe for centuries to come. But peace was fleeting, and the Austrians once again threatened the French borders in Italy. He planned a daring crossing of the Alps, dragging his cannons through the snow and ice. The soldiers marveled at his determination, hauling heavy guns over the Great St. Bernard Pass. He descended into Italy like an avalanche, taking the Austrian army completely by surprise. The Battle of Marengo hung in the balance, the French pushed to the breaking point. A timely arrival of reinforcements turned a near defeat into a crushing victory for the first consul. Austria was humbled once more, and a fragile peace settled over the war-torn continent. Napoleon turned his attention to England, gathering a massive invasion force at Boulogne. He drilled his troops relentlessly, creating the Grande Armée, the finest fighting force in Europe. But the British Navy remained the master of the seas, blocking his path across the Channel. He shifted his gaze eastward when Austria and Russia formed a new coalition against him. The speed of the Grande Armée was unleashed again, marching from the coast to the Danube. He surrounded the Austrian army at Ulm, forcing their surrender without fighting a major battle. This maneuver was a strategic masterpiece, eliminating an entire enemy army through speed alone. He marched into Vienna, the enemy capital, sleeping in the palace of the Austrian emperor. But the Russian army was approaching, and the decisive showdown was set for the fields of Austerlitz. He feigned weakness, abandoning the Pratzen heights to lure the enemy into a trap. The sun rose on the anniversary of his coronation, illuminating the mist-covered battlefield. He waited for the Russians to overextend their line before unleashing his strike at their center. The French infantry charged up the heights, splitting the Allied army in two with brutal efficiency. His artillery rained death upon the retreating Russians as they tried to cross the frozen lakes. Austerlitz was his masterpiece, the battle that solidified his legend as the god of war. The victory at Austerlitz shattered the Third Coalition and redrew the map of Germany. The Holy Roman Empire was dissolved, replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine under French protection. Prussia watched with growing alarm as French influence expanded to its very borders. Queen Louise of Prussia advocated for war, convinced that honor demanded a stand against the Corsican upstart. Napoleon moved with his customary speed, invading Saxony before the Prussian army could fully mobilize. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt destroyed the reputation of the Prussian military machine in a single day. At Jena, Napoleon commanded the main force, believing he faced the entire Prussian army. Davout performed a miracle at Auerstedt, defeating a vastly superior force with a single corps. The French army marched into Berlin, the soldiers sharpening their bayonets on the statue of Frederick the Great. From the heart of Berlin, Napoleon issued the decrees establishing the continental system against Britain. He sought to strangle the British economy by forbidding any trade between the continent and the island nation. But the Russians were still in the field, drawing the French into the frozen wastes of Poland. The winter campaign was brutal, the soldiers suffering from freezing mud and scarce supplies. At Eylau, the two armies clashed in a blinding snowstorm, the carnage reaching horrific levels. It was a draw that felt like a defeat, the field covered in thousands of frozen corpses. Napoleon visited the wounded, his face grim, as he witnessed the terrible cost of his ambition. He regrouped and waited for spring, reorganizing his supply lines and calling up new recruits. The Battle of Friedland in the summer was the decisive victory he needed to end the war. The Russian army was trapped against the river and destroyed by concentrated artillery fire. Tsar Alexander sued for peace, meeting Napoleon on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The two emperors embraced, dividing the world between them in a display of imperial brotherhood. This was the zenith of the Napoleonic Empire, with France ruling from the Atlantic to the Vistula. He returned to Paris as the master of Europe, surrounded by a court that rivaled the old monarchy. Yet the continental system required total control, leading him to look toward the Iberian Peninsula. He sent troops through Spain to invade Portugal, a longtime ally of the British crown. The Spanish royal family was dysfunctional, and Napoleon made the fatal error of removing them from power. He placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, believing the people would welcome French reforms. The 2 de Mayo uprising in Madrid signaled the beginning of a brutal and bloody guerrilla war. The Spanish people rose up with knives and outdated muskets, refusing to submit to foreign rule. French armies accustomed to conventional warfare found themselves bled dry by invisible enemies in the hills. The capitulation at Belen was a shock to the world, proving that French armies were not invincible. Napoleon was forced to intervene personally, leading the Grande Armée across the Pyrenees to restore order. He smashed the Spanish armies and captured Madrid, but he could not extinguish the fire of rebellion. News arrived of Austrian mobilization, forcing him to leave Spain unfinished to face a new threat in the east. The Austrian army had reformed under Archduke Charles, adopting the corps system and modern tactics. The campaign of 1809 was grueling, with the Austrians fighting with a new and desperate determination. At Aspern-Essling, Napoleon suffered his first major personal defeat, unable to cross the Danube River. The death of his friend, Marshal Lannes, struck a heavy blow to his heart. He retreated to the island of Lobau, planning his next move with cold and calculated fury. The Battle of Wagram was a clash of titans, the largest artillery battle the world had ever seen. He massed a grand battery of over 100 guns to blast a hole in the Austrian center. MacDonald led a massive infantry column into the fire, breaking the Austrian line at a terrible cost. Austria surrendered once again, but the victory had been bloody and the cracks were showing. The empire was vast but fragile, held together only by the genius of one man. Napoleon knew he needed an heir to secure his dynasty, a son to inherit the world he built. Josephine, his true love, could not give him a child, and the reality of politics intervened. The divorce was a tearful and public affair, a sacrifice of happiness for the sake of the state. He sought a bride from the old royal families of Europe to legitimize his rule. Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria was chosen, a marriage that united the revolution with the Habsburgs. The wedding was a spectacle of imperial grandeur, though the people of Paris missed the charm of Josephine. In 1811, the King of Rome was born, securing the succession and bringing joy to the emperor. The empire seemed secure, stretching from Rome to Hamburg, governed by French laws and administration, but the continental system was ruining the Russian economy, causing deep resentment in St. Petersburg. Tsar Alexander, under pressure from his nobles, began to open Russian ports to British trade. Napoleon viewed this as a betrayal of the Tilsit Agreement and a challenge to his authority. He began to gather the largest army in history, drawing troops from every corner of his empire. The Grande Armée of 1812 numbered over 600,000 men, a force of unprecedented magnitude. He planned a quick campaign to force the Russians back into the continental system. His advisors warned him against the vast distances and the harsh climate of the Russian interior. He ignored the warnings, believing in his star and the invincibility of his military machine. The crossing of the Niemen River marked the beginning of the end for the Napoleonic dream. The Russians refused to give battle, retreating deeper into their vast land and burning everything behind them. The French army marched into a wasteland, suffering from heat, dust, and disease before seeing an enemy. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and horses died by the thousands from exhaustion. Napoleon sought a decisive battle at Smolensk, but the Russians slipped away again, drawing him toward Moscow. The deeper he went, the more the discipline of his multinational army began to fray. Finally, at Borodino, the Russians turned to fight in defense of their holy city. It was the bloodiest day of the 19th century, a slugfest of attrition with no tactical brilliance. The French won the field, but the Russian army remained intact and withdrew in good order. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting a delegation of boyars to surrender the keys to the city. Instead, he found a ghost town, deserted by its inhabitants and stripped of supplies. That night, fires erupted across the city, set by Russian saboteurs to deny him winter quarters. He watched from the Kremlin as the city burned, realizing he had marched into a trap. He waited for a peace offer from the Tsar that never came, wasting precious weeks of autumn. The decision to retreat was made too late, and the winter arrived earlier than usual. The retreat from Moscow became a horror story of freezing cold, starvation, and constant Cossack attacks. The Grande Armée disintegrated into a mob of spectral figures wrapped in rags and stolen furs. At the Berezina River, they were nearly surrounded, only escaping through the heroism of the engineers. Napoleon left his army to rush back to Paris, hearing of a coup attempt against his government. He arrived to find his empire shaking, his allies turning against him, and his enemies united. The disaster in Russia echoed across the continent, waking sleeping enemies in every capital. Prussia broke its alliance, sensing the weakness of the French giant for the first time. Napoleon worked with manic energy, raising a new army from the youth of France. These young conscripts were brave but untrained, lacking the grim experience of the veterans lost in the snow. He marched into Germany to face the combined might of Russia and Prussia. At Lutzen, he displayed his old brilliance, leading raw recruits into the teeth of cannon fire. The victory was hard-fought, but he lacked the cavalry to pursue and destroy the retreating enemy. He followed up with another victory at Bautzen, proving the French eagle could still strike with deadly force. But his marshals were tired, and the soldiers were exhausted by the forced marches. He agreed to an armistice, a fatal error, that gave his enemies precious time to regroup and reinforce. Austria used this pause to mobilize its massive armies, tipping the balance of power against France. Metternich met with Napoleon in Dresden, offering terms that would strip France of its conquests. Napoleon rejected the offer, famously asking how many lives the diplomat was willing to sell. The war resumed, with Austria now joining the coalition, creating a ring of steel around the French. At Dresden, Napoleon achieved his last great victory in Germany, inflicting terrible losses on the Austrians. Rain soaked the battlefield, turning the streams into torrents that swept away men and horses. But the victory was hollow, as his marshals suffered defeats on other fronts, tightening the noose. The Allied armies converged on Leipzig, leading to the largest battle in European history. The Battle of Nations raged for 3 days, a cauldron of fire involving 500,000 men. Napoleon fought with his back to the wall, outnumbered 2-1 by the combined armies of Europe. The French infantry fought with desperate courage, holding the line against wave after wave of attacks. But the Saxon troops betrayed him in the heat of battle, turning their guns on their French allies. The betrayal opened a gap in the line, forcing Napoleon to order a difficult retreat across the river. Disaster struck when a corporal blew up the only bridge too early, stranding thousands of French troops. Poniatowski, the brave Polish marshal, drowned in the river trying to cover the retreat. The French army limped back to the Rhine, leaving the bones of the Grand Army in Germany. Typhus ravaged the ranks, killing more men than the enemy bullets as they crossed into France. The empire was crumbling, the Allied armies pouring across the borders from the north and south. Napoleon returned to Paris to find a nation exhausted and yearning for peace at any price. He faced a desperate situation with only a fragment of his former power to defend the homeland. The campaign of France would become his tactical masterpiece, fighting with the desperation of a cornered lion. He darted between the enemy columns, striking with the speed of lightning despite the mud and snow. At Champaubert, he crushed a Russian corps, taking thousands of prisoners with a small force. At Montmirail, he defeated the Prussians, utilizing the terrain to divide their superior numbers. The world watched in awe as the emperor seemed to be everywhere at once, winning 4 battles in 6 days. He slept in the snow with his men, eating the same meager rations and sharing their hardships. But for every enemy soldier killed, 10 more arrived to take their place from the vast reserves. The weight of numbers was irresistible, the sheer mass of the coalition grinding him down. He maneuvered to cut the enemy supply lines, hoping to force them to retreat from Paris. But Talleyrand betrayed him, sending word to the Allies that Paris was undefended and ready to fall. The Allied armies marched on the capital, brushing aside the weak defenses of the National Guard. Napoleon raced back to save his capital, but he arrived too late to prevent the surrender. He gathered his army at Fontainebleau, prepared to march on Paris and fight in the streets. But his marshals were done weary of endless war and convinced that further resistance was futile. Ney spoke for them all, declaring that the army would obey its generals and not the emperor. Napoleon sat alone in the palace, realizing that his power had evaporated like morning mist. He signed the act of abdication, renouncing the thrones of France and Italy for himself and his heirs. In a moment of despair, he took poison that he had carried since the Russian campaign. His strong constitution rejected the lethal dose, leaving him sick, but alive to face his fate. The Allies granted him sovereignty over the tiny island of Elba, allowing him to keep the title of emperor. The farewell to the old guard was a scene of heartbreaking emotion in the palace courtyard. He walked among his weeping veterans, kissing the flag of the Eagles in a final salute. He boarded the carriage that would take him into exile, leaving behind the world he had remade. The journey to the coast was dangerous, with royalist mobs threatening to lynch the fallen tyrant. He arrived at the port and boarded a British frigate, staring back at the receding coast of France. Elba was a cage too small for a giant who had ruled a continent. He threw himself into the administration of his tiny kingdom, paving roads and building mines. He created a miniature court, maintaining the etiquette of the Tuileries in a villa by the sea. He watched the horizon constantly, his eyes fixed on the distant coastline of Italy and France. Spies surrounded him, reporting his every move to the restored Bourbon government in Paris. But news traveled fast, and he heard the grumbling of his former soldiers under the royalists. Louis XVIII was unpopular, having returned in the baggage train of the foreign enemies. The French people resented the return of the old nobility and the threat to their land. Napoleon sensed the shifting wind, knowing that his time to gamble everything had come again. He made secret preparations, disguising his plans as routine naval exercises for his small guard. On a moonless night, he slipped away with 1,000 men, embarking on the brigand Constant. They evaded the British patrol ships, sailing silently toward the coast of France. He landed at Gulf of Juan, marching onto the beach with the tricolor held high. The local peasants stared in disbelief as the man they thought dead or exiled walked among them. He began the march to Paris, moving through the mountains to avoid the royalist garrisons. The road to Grenoble became the stage for one of the most dramatic moments in history. The 5th Line Infantry Regiment blocked his path, their muskets leveled at his chest. He walked forward alone, his gray overcoat open to show the star of the Legion of Honor. He shouted to them, "If there is one among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of the wind. Then a cry of "Long live the emperor" erupted as the soldiers lowered their weapons. They rushed forward to embrace him, tears streaming down their faces as they pinned on the tricolor. His army grew with every mile, dragging cannons and supplies along the dusty roads. Marshal Ney promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. But upon seeing his old commander, Ney was overcome by emotion and defected with his entire army. The road to Paris lay open, the Bourbon court fleeing in panic before the approaching storm. Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace at night, carried up the grand staircase by a delirious crowd. The 100 Days had begun a frantic period of reorganization and preparation for war. He offered peace to the nations of Europe, promising to abide by the existing borders. But the Allies declared him an outlaw, a disturber of the tranquility of the world. They pledged to raise 1,000,000 men to crush him once and for all. Napoleon knew he could not wait for them to combine their overwhelming forces against him. He decided to strike first, attacking the Allied armies in Belgium before they could unite. He worked 18 hours a day, refitting the army and rallying the nation for war. The French army that gathered was small but fierce, composed entirely of devoted veterans. He marched north in secret, aiming for the junction between the British and Prussian armies. His strategy was to separate them and defeat each one in detail before they could support each other. He crossed the border, catching the Allies completely by surprise as they attended a ball in Brussels. Wellington was shocked, realizing that Napoleon had humbugged him with his speed and deception. On June 16th, the French army struck 2 blows simultaneously at Ligny and Quatre Bras. At Ligny, Napoleon faced the Prussians under Blucher, engaging in a brutal slugging match. The fighting was savage bayonet charges sweeping back and forth through the burning villages. The Old Guard finally broke the Prussian center, forcing them to retreat into the darkness. But the victory was incomplete, as the Prussians managed to escape destruction due to a confusion in orders. At Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney fought the British to a standstill, but failed to take the crossroads. The opportunity to crush Wellington separate from Blucher had been missed by a hair's breadth. A violent thunderstorm broke over the region, turning the roads into rivers of mud. Napoleon followed the retreating British army, which took up a defensive position on a low ridge. The ridge was called Mont Saint-Jean, but history would know it as Waterloo. He surveyed the field on the morning of June 18th, confident in his superior numbers. The ground was sodden, making it difficult to maneuver his beloved artillery batteries. He delayed the attack, waiting for the sun to dry the mud so his cannonballs could bounce. This delay would prove fatal, giving the Prussians time to regroup and march to Wellington's aid. He sat in a chair near the farm of Rossomme, suffering from illness but projecting calm. His plan was simple, a frontal assault to break the British line with brute force. He despised Wellington as a sepoy general, believing the British would crumble under sustained pressure. The battle opened with a diversionary attack on the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont on the right. He intended to draw Wellington's reserves into the fight for the chateau, weakening the center. But the British guards held Hougoumont with tenacious courage, turning the farm into a fortress. The diversion became a trap for the French, sucking in more and more troops, to no avail. The French infantry surged forward through the rye fields, their drums beating the pas de charge. They were met by a storm of musket fire and the disciplined volleys of the British redcoats. The attack faltered and the heavy cavalry of the British charged, ensuring a bloody repulse. Napoleon watched grimly, realizing this would not be the easy victory he had predicted. He ordered the Grand Battery to unleash a hurricane of iron on the British center. 80 guns roared, creating a wall of smoke and noise that shook the earth. Under the cover of this fire, Marshal Ney prepared a massive cavalry charge to break the line. But the British infantry formed hollow squares, a tactic Napoleon had used in Egypt. The French cuirassiers circled the squares, their swords useless against the hedge of bayonets. Wave after wave of horsemen crashed against the red walls, only to recede like the tide. Napoleon watched the slaughter through his telescope, his face a mask of stone. He saw the dark columns of the Prussians emerging from the woods on his right flank. He realized that Blucher had kept his promise and was coming to save his ally. He was now fighting 2 battles, one against Wellington in front and one against Blucher on the side. He sent the young guard to hold back the Prussians, fighting desperately in the village of Plancenoit. The smoke lay thick over the valley, obscuring the carnage of men and horses. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the field of death. He knew the moment of crisis had arrived, the time to play his final card. He ordered the Imperial Guard forward, the invincible elite who had never been defeated. The tall bearskins moved through the smoke, marching to the beat of the drums. The guard marched past the emperor, their eyes fixed on the British ridge. They ascended the slope, entering the cauldron of fire and death. Wellington waited until they were close before unleashing his hidden infantry. The volley devastated the French columns, halting the advance in its tracks. The unthinkable happened. The cry went up, the guard retreats. Panic spread like wildfire through the ranks, shattering the French discipline. The entire army began to dissolve into a chaotic mob of fugitives. Napoleon rode into a square of the guard, hoping to find death, but his marshals dragged him away, forcing him to leave the field. The Prussians pursued ruthlessly, their cavalry cutting down the fleeing stragglers. The carriage of the emperor was captured with his hat and sword. He rode through the night, arriving in Paris exhausted and covered in dust. He wanted to raise the militia and fight on to the bitter end. But the political sharks in Paris smelled blood and turned against him. Fouché, the master of intrigue, manipulated the chamber to demand his abdication. Napoleon realized he had lost the support of the nation's elite. He signed the second abdication, this time in favor of his son. It was a meaningless gesture, as the Allies had already decided on the Bourbon. He lingered at Malmaison, walking in the garden where Josephine had once bloomed. He said farewell to his mother, a woman of iron who never wept. He fled to the coast, hoping to find a ship bound for America. He dreamed of a life as a private citizen, studying science in the New World. But the Royal Navy blockaded the harbor, their sails visible on the horizon. He was trapped between the advancing royalists and the British steel at sea. He made the fateful decision to surrender to his most constant enemy. He wrote a letter to the Prince Regent claiming the protection of British laws. He boarded the HMS Bellerophon expecting to be treated as a guest of honor. The British sailors stared in awe at the ogre they had been taught to hate. He charmed the crew with his curiosity and his dignified bearing. The ship sailed for England, anchoring off the coast of Plymouth. Crowds of boats surrounded the vessel people, eager to glimpse the fallen Titan. But the British government had no intention of letting him set foot on their soil. They feared his presence would spark revolution or another war. The verdict was delivered cold and final exile to the island of St. Helena. It was a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from anywhere. Napoleon protested, claiming it was a violation of his rights and hospitality. He was transferred to the HMS Northumberland for the long voyage south. The journey was tedious, the ship cutting through the endless blue waste. He dictated his memoirs, pacing the small cabin as if it were a palace. He crossed the equator for the first time, asking the sailors about their traditions. The Southern Cross appeared in the sky, a sign that he was in a new world. After months at sea, the grim silhouette of St. Helena rose from the mist. It was a volcanic fortress of black rock, beaten by the restless ocean. He landed at Jamestown, a small village nestled in a narrow ravine. The air was damp and heavy, a stark contrast to the dry heat of Egypt. He stayed initially at a small cottage called the Briars, befriending the Balcom family. For a brief moment, he found laughter playing games with the young Betsy Balcom. But this interlude ended when he was moved to his permanent prison, Longwood House. Longwood was a wretched place, exposed to the constant trade winds and fog. The house was damp and infested with rats that scurried across the floors. He was guarded by thousands of soldiers and a squadron of ships. The governor of the island, Sir Hudson Lowe, arrived to enforce strict regulations. Lowe was a petty bureaucrat obsessed with rules and terrified of an escape. He refused to address Napoleon as an emperor, calling him only General Bonaparte. This insult enraged Napoleon, who clung to his title as his last dignity. A war of etiquette began between the prisoner and his jailer. Napoleon refused to see Lowe, locking himself in his rooms for days. He spent his time dictating the story of his campaigns to his loyal generals. Las Cases Gourgaud and Montalon served as his scribes, recording every word. He knew that his pen was now his only weapon against the British narrative. He fought to define his legacy, ensuring history would see him as a liberator. The climate began to take its toll on his health, dampening his spirits. He complained of pain in his side and a constant fatigue that drained him. He gardened furiously, trying to create a wall of green to hide the sentries. He wore a path in the grass, pacing back and forth like a caged lion. The news from Europe was sparse, filtered by the governor to demoralize him. He heard of the White Terror in France, the execution of his brave Ney. He wept for his marshal, the bravest of the brave, shot by a firing squad. He thought of his son, the King of Rome, growing up a stranger in Austria. He worried that the boy would be taught to hate his own father. The days turned into years, a slow death of boredom and petty humiliations. He read incessantly, devouring the books in the library sent from London. He replayed his battles, moving colored pins on the map spread on the table. He asked himself where he had gone wrong, analyzing his errors at Waterloo. He concluded that destiny had simply turned against him, and his time was done. The fog rolled in daily, obscuring the sun and covering the house in gloom. He began to stay in bed longer, his energy fading with the setting sun. The doctors argued over his diagnosis, some suspecting liver disease, others poison. He suspected he was dying of the same cancer that had killed his father. He made his will, distributing his few possessions among his loyal followers. He asked that his ashes be buried on the banks of the Seine. He wanted to rest among the French people he had loved so much. The end approached in May of 1821, accompanied by a storm. The wind howled around Longwood, tearing up the trees he had planted. He drifted in and out of delirium, his mind wandering back to the battlefield. He saw the faces of his soldiers, the glittering eagles in the smoke of cannon. His last words were whispered, barely audible, over the sound of the storm. France, the army, the head of the army. Josephine. He breathed his last as the sun set on the lonely rock in the ocean. The greatest military mind in history was still his battles finally over. The British soldiers buried him in a quiet valley beneath two willow trees. They refused to inscribe the name Emperor on the stone, leaving the grave nameless. 12 British grenadiers carried the coffin, their heads bowed in respect for the warrior. A simple iron railing surrounded the site, guarding the remains of the conqueror. For 19 years, he lay in the volcanic soil of the lonely island. But in Europe, the legend of Napoleon began to grow stronger than the man. The publication of his memoirs ignited a fire in the imagination of the world. The Romantic poets wrote of his tragic fall, seeing him as a modern Prometheus. He became a symbol of genius and ambition, crushed by the mediocrity of kings. In France, the Bourbon monarchy fell, replaced by the citizen king Louis Philippe. The new government sought to heal the wounds of the past by honoring the emperor. In 1840, the decision was made to bring his body home to France. The Prince de Joinville sailed to St. Helena to retrieve the precious cargo. The exhumation was a solemn affair performed under the eyes of the surviving companions. The coffin was opened, revealing his face perfectly preserved by time and the elements. He looked as if he were merely sleeping, his uniform still intact. The veterans wept to see their master again, untouched by the decay of death. The coffin was loaded onto the frigate Belle Poule for the long journey north. When the ship arrived in France, the nation stopped to welcome its hero home. The barge traveled up the Seine River, passing through the heart of the country. Crowds lined the riverbanks, braving the freezing cold to catch a glimpse. Old soldiers pulled out their faded uniforms and rusty medals to stand at attention. They cried out, "Long live the Emperor," as the black barge drifted past silently. It was a funeral, but also a triumph, a final victory over his enemies. On December 15th, the procession moved through the streets of Paris under falling snow. The hearse was a massive chariot of gold and velvet, drawn by 16 horses. It passed under the Arc de Triomphe, the monument he had ordered to be built. The crowd was silent, a sea of millions watching the return of the eagle. He was carried into the Invalides, the home of the army he had loved. The king awaited him by the dome, formally receiving the body of the emperor. He was laid to rest in a sarcophagus of red porphyry fit for a pharaoh. He rests there still under the golden dome, surrounded by the names of his victories. His legacy survived long after his bones had turned to dust in the tomb. The map of Europe was forever changed by the borders he had drawn. The Holy Roman Empire was gone, never to return, replaced by a German identity. Italy had tasted unity, a dream that would eventually lead to its independence. The feudal system was shattered in the lands where his armies had marched. Aristocratic privilege was replaced by the concept of merit and equality before the law. The Napoleonic Code remains the foundation of law in France and many other nations. He proved that a man from nowhere could rise to the pinnacle of power. He showed that talent and ambition could overthrow the stagnant order of the past. His military maxims are still studied in academies from West Point to Sandhurst. He revolutionized warfare, teaching the world the value of speed and concentrated force. But the cost of his glory was paid in the blood of millions. Battlefields across Europe are fertilized with the remains of the generation he led. Was he a hero of the revolution or a tyrant who betrayed its ideals? The debate continues to this day, echoing in the halls of history. He was a man of contradictions, a liberator who crowned himself an absolute monarch. He brought order to chaos, but unleashed a storm that consumed a continent. He was the god of war, yet he dreamed of a united, peaceful Europe. His life was a tragedy of hubris, a reminder of the limits of power. Yet his spirit lingers in the soul of France and the memory of the world. He was the meteor that burned too bright, leaving a trail of fire. He was the little corporal who became the master of kings. He was the artillery officer who aimed his cannons at the heart of destiny. He was Napoleon Bonaparte, and his story,